a senior technical writer here at Vistar Media. I've been a technical writer in the industry for about 6 years, and if we get really fuzzy, I worked in IT for about 4 years, so we can go for 10. Um, I primarily work with SaaS softwares. I worked at companies like ByteDance, Medable, Viva Systems, and I've just really enjoyed my career working as a technical writer. So when Josh reached out about if I wanted to talk about what I've been up to, I said, sure, I'm happy to be here.
And now I would love to hear the story of how you got into technical writing. Was this something that you identified early on and you're like, hey, like early in college, like I want to be a writer, or is this something you sort of stumbled into?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Josh. It's actually a great interview question too, because I ask that all the time. Um, so technical writing is an interesting field, right? I think people always think like technical writing is about just writing manuals, and they're like, oh, I look at an iPhone and I never look at an iPhone manual. But I realized that I was interested in technical writing when I worked in IT in college. And a lot of that process of like trying to teach someone how to fix their own computer problems is in fact technical writing. So professor comes in, they have no clue what they're doing, and they're like, my computer won't turn on. Your job is to fix that problem, then document the problem so your undergraduate friends can figure out that issue as well, right? So that's kind of what perked my attention. My college offered a technical writing program, so I decided to take a couple classes, and I said, hey, this is super applicable. And that's kind of how I just jump started my career into it. And it's been a blast ever since.
And then what was that process like? You're like, hey, I identified what I want to do, but now I actually have to land my first job in technical writing.
Mm-hmm.
What was the process of actually making yourself a marketable candidate? Did you go through referrals? Was it a lot of working on your portfolio? What were those steps?
Yeah. So the process for like kind of getting a job in the industry, I think used to be very like in-depth knowledge. Like you needed to know a lot about like the specific subject area that you were going to write for. So what I mean by that, and expanding a little bit more, is my first job that I got was in product marketing for a digital commerce platform called Digital River, right? And I was under the impression as a technical writer that I had to be an expert and know everything about the thing even before I joined the company, right? So I was studying, I was doing my research, and I walk into the interview and I realized all my concepts were wrong. But one of the big things was like, hey, you seem super enthusiastic and super curious about this. Like, I think that's a really big asset that we need. We can teach you what's going on here, but your important role here is trying to learn as much as you can. And it's very clear that you did a lot of prep work for that. So to answer your question fully, Josh, I think a big way to get into the industry is just being super enthusiastic about like the jobs that you're applying for, trying to figure out what they're doing, like how they do things.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Part of it is that it's something that we don't hear enough too,
Hmm.
is if you go into an interview and you're not as excited about the people who are already there, about how their excitement level of the product, then they're
Yeah,
gonna be like, why do I want to go down to a lower energy level where this person
exactly.
how they feel?
Yeah. No, it's like it's so much more validating too because you're like, oh, at least he's curious about what we're doing instead of you having to sell the sizzle. There's a couple companies that I like you kind of go above and beyond as technical writers because you kind of like can see their publicly facing documentation and then you can be like, oh, this is what I'm going to be working with day to day. So once you start speaking the same language, it helps a lot when you're applying for jobs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
big difference. And I was talking to someone recently. They like labeled it as like this exciting personality that you have to bring to the table, and you have
Yeah.
to really focus on that. Otherwise, they're going to be like, why is this person here? So
I find that one of the things I look for in candidates sometimes is like just being easy to get along with. I know it's like a little bit of a tough thing, but you do have to stretch your social muscle, like because there are people who have a lot of time, a lot of things on their hands, and you're just trying to figure out like what are the ways that I can connect with someone to figure out like, hey, like I want to tell you what I'm thinking about, and I want you to tell me like exactly what you need as well. So.
yeah,
Mhm.
very true. Then curious of some of the things that you're doing right now and how you're involved in the document development cycle. Talk to us about some of the specifics of your role.
Yeah, sure. So it's actually a little funny because I was poking around on LinkedIn for you, Josh, and I was like, "Hey, you have like a couple of people that I know in my old career." So previous company I worked at was a company called Medable. I was the first technical writer hired there, and my job was laying out the groundwork for like what technical documentation looked like. You get like these PDFs, these handbooks that are like 3 years old, kind of outdated, but not necessarily outdated enough that they don't stop sending it out. Um, So like establishing those processes and like figuring out how to scale a company that's going on that hockey shaped stick like growth curve where I was a team of one, and then by the time I left that company, it was like a team of 20 technical writers. So just trying to figure out foundationally what that looked like. Now I started again at my new company called Vistar Media, where I'm the only technical writer on the product team. And we're just trying to figure out how to scale our documentation, what that looks like in the documentation development lifecycle. That's a fun word. And I have questions about that too later, Josh. Um, and like also just trying to establish like what technical writing looks like if you have like kind of a fresh field and you have some prior experience. And yeah, that's kind of what I'm up to right now. Like very recently I've been like figuring out how a content calendar looks like, right? Or like even developing API documentation using newer tools versus like some of the older tools that are out there, but most people like using.
And building a team from scratch is a very, I would say, unique experience. Many technical
Mhm.
writers never get the chance to do that. I'd love to hear
Really?
a little bit more about some things that went into that for you.
Got it. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you about the "oh really" part, but I think building a team from scratch is always fun, right? Like in certain cases, you have an opportunity to look for things that you value, and then try to replicate it. I think hiring is going to be the biggest challenge that you have in the technical writing field because there's such a broad spectrum of like candidates that are coming in from a lot of different backgrounds. Um, So what I think that's like very important for me personally, at least when you're building a team from scratch, is like flexibility and technical knowledge, right? We like built out like certain exercises. This is at my previous company, and then at my current company, we're like kind of thinking about like what are the established processes that a technical writer even needs to bring to the table to even be considered for a position, right? Um, so like technical knowledge, like learning how to like code to a certain degree, or at least read API documentation, having enthusiasm for like learning new technologies, or if an engineer decides like, hey, I want to try out this like new way of using Datadog, how do I consume this information and put it on a dashboard? What those internal workflows look like, and like talking through if people have had previous experience and trying to figure that out. So I guess to answer your question more succinctly, though, I would say that things like that I experienced building a team from scratch is hiring is your biggest problem, and you should spend as much time as possible figuring it out because there are times where if you introduce like more heaviness to like the workflow, it makes it slower to even effectively do technical writing. Where I've seen like small teams be more effective than bigger teams.
And I'm curious of how much of a difference a portfolio makes. One is that I see a lot of technical writer resumes, and a lot of them look
Yeah.
good, but they don't have a portfolio. And I think to myself of people who
Uh
are
huh.
busy, such as yourselves, and going like, well, this person may have a little less experience, but at least I can get an idea of what they've done.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
how do you feel about portfolios and the value that they bring?
So portfolios are tough. Because it just takes that like another step of effort to like even like jump into like another person's portfolio compared to sending them a technical exercise that you kind of know the answers already, and then you're able to kind of validate based off like I see where the assumptions he's making about this and this might be wrong, or she might be like trying to do something and I can kind of see where she's going with it. Um so I guess to your point, portfolios allow you to put a foot in the door, right? I think they enable like our end users, or like when I say end users, they enable like people who are interviewing to like understand the scope of what work you've done. But a lot of that information just becomes more clear when you're able to have that person to person conversation. So if you have a portfolio, I would say like just come strong and be like, this is what I did in my portfolio, which I referenced earlier. And then you can even like screen share during the interview about it. Right. So that's what I would say about portfolios. I actually have done that at a couple interviews too.
You made a great point there about exercises. I did work for a company that had sort of this automated email of people who would apply, and then the
Mhm.
email would automatically send out to them and say, "Hey, do this exercise," and then they just
Oh,
start filtering that way. Uh,
uh-huh.
they didn't even look at the resumes first, you
I
know.
know that is rough. Mhm.
Yeah, there's lots of ways to do it.
Yeah. I have a friend who works for a company called Carrot, and they do engineering interviews, but it's like a third party. It's actually quite interesting. They're like starting to outsource even like interviewing for candidates for your company nowadays. So,
Wow.
mhm,
Yeah, you got to get more than a portfolio. It's like you gotta take action. I mean, that's really what it is. And then
mhm.
yeah, curious of some of the tools that you're using. I know you threw around a couple names already, but would love for you to dive a little bit deeper and maybe you're also, since you're the first technical writer at your company, building a new tool stack for the technical writing department within your company. What does that look like in previous companies that you've worked with, the tools there, and what you're doing currently?
Got it. So I guess my question here, Josh, is how hot takes can we make here? Like from a scale of 0 to 10, where are we going with this?
Oh man, I think that the big thing is that there's a lot of documentation tools out there,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of people are using like older documentation tools, and they
Mm,
haven't looked at new ones. And part of it, they're like, well, Madcat Flare is a little bit
mm-hmm.
complicated, and then you have like Confluence, which a lot of teams use, but it's like it doesn't do the things that Madcap can offer.
Mm,
And then they're like, is there anything else that could sort of like offer ease of like
mm-hmm.
usability? And then what's going on in the API documentation world? Are you still
Mm. Oh,
like
it changes
older
all the time.
practices? Yeah.
Everyone's like, I
There's a
thought
lot.
Swagger was a new one, and now we're like static sites. No, now we do README. Now, no, I get it. Like, there's a bunch of different tools, right? The reason why I asked that, Josh, is because like I think when in my career at least, people have developed like lines of allegiances with specific tools, right? So it's always a little bit dangerous whenever you like talk to someone new and you're like, oh, you love Madcap Flare. I also love Madcap Flare. Like I've had opportunities to use pretty much every tool under the sun in my career, right? Like Zendesk was a big one at ByteDance. Madcap Flare was a big one at Viva. And one of the like more interesting things is like foundationally, people seem to like want to switch to new tools whenever they join a company. But I think that as technical writers, we need to be like more considered about even like what our base assumptions are about how to publish documentation. And this is like in the cloud, but this is the perfect audience to even like spitball about this. So I'm here for it. What I mean by that is like we're trying to establish really good processes at Vistar first before we even like start considering like what our end tool might look like. Because currently our stack looks like a bunch of Google Docs with a couple PDFs. We use Confluence for internal documentation. Engineering siloed their own documentation. Like there is an established process, and like it all works for individuals right now, right? But it doesn't work as a whole. But we don't want to interrupt that individual process for like the goal of having like some overarching amazing tool that you can use content reuse and all these things without people all understanding and buying in for what value it gives. So I don't have a great question outside of like we currently use Zendesk. I'm actually in the active states of looking at other third-party platforms for developer portals. That was like literally last week. And I have thoughts, right? Like I think there is value in like all these new ones where like MarkDoc just came out, and that's essentially the open source version of Stripe's documentation, um, which I also have hot takes about. And then like README.io seems super like collaborative and super useful, but it requires a lot of engineering input. We're also validating against like Postman collections, where you can like create your own developer portal using Postman. So there's a thousand tools under the sun, right? It's just trying to figure out what your use case is and who your audience looks like too.
Yeah, I think also the level of accessibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
And um, like you were saying, it's like some people are going to use Google Docs. They don't want to learn Madcap. It's like trying
Yeah.
to get a product manager. You're like, hey, I need you to use Madcap. That's
Oh
just
my
never
gosh.
going to
We once
happen.
had 23 Madcap contributor licenses that just never got used because product managers never looked at it.
Yeah, I think just getting them to like just stay in Google Docs or like Confluence or whatever it is like hard enough, and just like
Mm-hmm. And
yeah.
honestly, I would argue it's not the worst thing in the world, but that's personal opinion. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious to see, like, I feel like there's going to be something out there. I know there was this tool recently I was checking out called Almanac, but then I feel like the level of complexity just sometimes gets too much, where they're like, are
Mm.
we gearing towards like a whole overarching audience, or just
Mm-hmm.
technical writers? Like, who is it? And then
Yeah.
and then they get stuck in this like middle ground.
Mhm. I
Um,
think Polygo's also another one that's like been popping around more lately, and I've been like, oh, interesting. I know Tom Johnson from like I'd Rather Be Writing talks about it a couple times, but I haven't really talked to Tom in a while, so I don't know what his thoughts are on all these like platforms.
yeah, I did hear about that one. Another one is Document 360,
Yep, I've heard of that
which
one too.
yeah, we'll see. Time will tell.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually the hot take here is more like things are shifting towards something like Notion or even like Airtable.
Hmm.
These are like really light I have a couple of friends that like work at Notion, right? And like you can see the marketing is just replacing like quote unquote internal wikis with Notion and then just making them external. And it's like, well, the relevant information's there, so you're good to go now. So it's kind of
Yeah.
interesting.
I think it's the idea of heavy integration, so you can like just
Hmm.
integrate with whatever platforms
Yeah.
different teams prefer to use. Because there's just going to be, like you're saying, teams that are like, "Hey, we want to use Madcap, we want to use Confluence, we want to use this," and it's like,
Hmm.
okay, well, let's just have everybody use what they want to use. You know?
I actually think the role of technical writing is becoming more like a technical librarian. It's like your role is like figuring out where the information is. So when people ask questions, you can tell them what's going on.
Yeah, that's very true. It's like being able to surface information quickly,
Hmm.
and understanding how to do that. There's a tool I was looking at, Get Guru, which I was didn't know how big they were growing until I was in SF recently, and I saw, like, when they're on all the billboards, and you're like,
Yeah,
okay, this is like a tool company that probably raised a lot of funding recently and is really trying to push for it.
I love it.
Um,
My current company works with billboards actually. So every time someone talks about it, I'm like, interesting.
Uh, yeah, I think that
Mhm.
idea of surfacing information quickly is relatively new, though. That's and
Mm.
focusing heavily on that. Um,
Yeah. I
yeah,
we did an interesting implementation of, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Algolia. It's like a search engine that you can kind of embed in like existing documentation websites. Like the idea of surfacing information and capturing sentiment as a technical writer is actually super valuable. Like, for example, you can look at analytics for people that look at your documents, but if you have analytics on the questions that people are asking and not getting answers, I think that's super valuable. So, yeah, like,
yeah,
yeah, no, I agree. Like, it's super valuable about surfacing information or trying to make sure, like, across like Confluence, GitBooks, your API documentation portal, you can search one query and find what you're looking for.
yeah. I think that the other part of that issue is then if you can surface it quickly, then like, is it like verifiable information that you can then use? Yeah.
Oh man, at that point you're just down a rabbit hole of like, do I need to update every screenshot, every video I make whenever there's a patch update?
Oh my gosh. Um, well, let's talk about. I feel like we just talked a lot about like some of the current challenges, but
Mhm.
and we talked a little bit about the future. I'd love to hear some of the more thoughts about the future because I think it's always an awesome topic
Yeah.
of where you feel like the role of the technical writer is going.
Mhm.
Um, is it breaking down into more specific roles, like we're seeing like the API technical writer, SaaS
Mm.
technical writer, and um, UX writer, which is not necessarily like one in one with a technical writer per se, but there's a lot of heavy opinions there. But would love to hear your thoughts around where the role is going.
Got it. And Nabil asked, why not using stoplight? I'm not actually sure what stoplight is as a tool, so it's a good question.
Yeah, I'm not familiar either. Otherwise,
Yeah. So your question was breaking down of like specific roles as technical writers, right? So previously, I would say like if you asked me 20 years ago, there used to be like a technical writer editor, there used to be a technical writer, maybe like a technical writer um maybe like what is it? In the industry, there's people that know separate areas of their knowledge or like I'm in charge of this product line and things like that. To answer like your question now, if I was like hiring people, it would be more focused on like skill sets. So for example, I have a friend who just got hired at Roblox as a technical writer, right? Which is like a pretty big San Francisco company, and they're trying to grow their organization, like at least scale their technical writing organization, because from their perspective, technical writing is like onboarding 101. If you want new users, you have to have good documentation, right? And then you need to like be able to like contribute by like having good context behind what your documentation's for, right? So my friend is like a YouTube guy. He like tried to have his career being a YouTube star, making like his career about like editing videos or writing documentation about like how Premiere Pro works and things like that. So the point I'm trying to make here is like you have these like technical writers that are very trained in particular contexts of the field. And I think from a hiring manager's perspective, and this is just my personal opinion too, they are looking at candidates less of like what tools they know and like what they bring to the field there, but more about like what their contextual skills look like. Like, for example, they're really strong candidates in like trying to learn new technologies. They're like super enthusiastic about APIs and like, oh, like I tried to figure that Twitter API to make a Twitter bot, like blah, 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 and then this happened. Or I tried to actually use Stripe's documentation because everyone talks about it and it's really confusing and I don't know how to use it. Um, and I think that gives a lot more value towards like what the future of technical writing looks like is like trying to figure out what they're interested contextually and then looking for like what skills they might bring to the table or what they can bring to the table from like a product perspective, like new insights into like developing the organization, ability to like edit videos and like understand like even from like a product marketing perspective what the buy-in is from the target audiences. Yeah, so it's not a great question. I'm just saying like usually when a candidate comes in and you're super enthusiastic about them, I think it's because of like their like context of what they've brought to the table, not necessarily what tools they know.
Very true. And I think part of that is like wanting to be the end user of the product too.
Hmm.
Just helps so much. Like, so I feel like a rare thing to find, unfortunately, unless you're
Oh
working for
yeah.
a social media company.
I mean,
Yeah,
I worked at ByteDance, right? That's the company that owns TikTok, and you have these like very like varying like interests in how to like even pitch your own documentation idea. So like we ran ByteDance pretty much like a product team actually, where you like had discovery for what documentation looked good and trying to figure out like how it would fit in the with the end users.
interesting. Yeah,
Hmm.
wild man. Would love to talk about some of the challenges that you go through. One is like,
Mm.
we talked a little bit about some of the challenges in building a team. What are some of
Hmm.
the challenges that you face with one being the document development lifecycle, and then
Mm.
also trying to merge that with product and how a product is getting developed and making sure that, which is never easy,
Mm.
and also communicating with SMEs and all that.
Oh, you just asked me to do my job, right? Like, so I guess Josh, let me tackle you with a question too. What do you mean by document development lifecycle?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, when you're looking at the document development lifecycle, it's this idea that trying to match the product development lifecycle in
Hmm.
the best way. That's how I sort of see it.
Got
And
it.
like, how do you do that? Um, Now, I think some people look at it as like more of like, hey, this is when you do editing. This is when,
Hmm.
and that type of view. To me, it's like sort of starting with an end goal in mind, which is
Mm.
how do you match the product development lifecycle? Because if that doesn't match, like
Hmm.
everything else is sort of off.
So what's interesting is that you end up with so many different life cycles, at least at a growing company. You have a product development life cycle, you have a software development life cycle, now we have a documentation development life cycle. You also have the customer prospecting life cycle, right? Like what it looks like from sales, and then you also have like the support life cycle, right? Like what it looks like from a person submitting a ticket to agent to either getting a response or having the appropriate amount of like context available to answer the customer's question. So the reason why I asked that question too, Josh, is like as like a technical writing organization, it gets a very fuzzy very quickly because your goal almost is like an overarching area of like tracking the feature as it goes to the product, as it goes to the end result. You write a piece of documentation and then you really hope, but you don't necessarily know if that documentation is getting inserted into the like customer support lifecycle, right? Like, so I guess to answer your question is I think we need to zoom out a lot more and like even like understanding what like our end result looks like instead of just looking at analytics and being like, look, 300 people looked at my document, it was successful, right?
Hmm.
To answer also your question earlier about like what is the hardest thing is like it's very easy I think as technical writers to just kind of write what people say, right? um so what I mean by that, and this is something that I have ongoing with like even my own personal like trying to work stuff, is like you can get spread thin very quickly. And the goal at the end of the day is that you are knowledgeable enough about one specific thing that you understand a person's pain point, and then you can explain it in a way that like makes people like more understanding or like more contextually aware of that. And a small example I usually use is this like you're trying to play a board game with a bunch of friends. And you're the one that knows the board game and no one else knows it. You know the problem of like it's really fun. Just trust me. Like we need to figure out like this is Settlers of Catan. You have these pieces, you put them on the board, and then you do this, and then you do this, right? And like getting their eyes to light up afterwards when they figure out, okay, this is why the board game is fun, is what technicals writers do on a day-to-day basis. But it's so easy to just be like, just read the manual or like point at something that a product manager might have written, and it's our job to actually like explain those rules in a way that's like entertaining, interesting, and makes people want to play that board game. So I think that's the hardest thing for me is just trying to dive deep into the nuance instead of just like cheating essentially and pointing to something that product manager might have already written.
I do think that's why like a lot of personalized onboarding exists today,
Hmm.
especially with let's say I was just trying to check out like Get Guru recently,
Mm.
and they had me join their demo with maybe it was like 10 other people,
Hmm.
and trying to do it at scale so it's a bit effective. And I'm there going like, okay, well this makes sense because there's so much documentation around the product, and like I don't really want to dive into it. I'm not ready. I need to be still like, hey, we're going to show you it and have good experience first, and then you'll have enough interest to dive into more documentation on your own.
Mm.
And I think it's very much similar to what you said, is that products can get quite complex and you're
Hmm.
just not ready there. You got to get like, sort of drag through some personalization and like
Yeah.
one-on-one touch point, and then you're like, okay, now I'll do it.
I I mean, there is an argument there where like that's what sales should be doing, right? Or that's what support should be doing in some ways. Like, what is technicals writing's role in there? Are we product marketers? Like, what does that mean?
It is interesting. It's yeah, there's so much role overlap, and it's
Hmm.
hard to know, yeah, where that balance is, and then
Yeah,
trying to keep
yeah.
things in scope so you're like not going crazy, right?
Oh yeah.
Which is the hard part.
But maybe we
Uh,
are just a little crazy anyways because we chose this career.
yeah. It's like everything needs documentation. It's like, and documentation looks like everything. I'm like, what
Mhm.
does this mean?
I mean, I
uh,
think like an offshoot is developer advocacy, right? Like that is I've actually had a couple questions of like where does that live in the technical writing org? Does that live in marketing, right? Like you own the developer portal, shouldn't you be developer advocacy? Like so I mean,
makes
yeah,
sense.
people are
Yeah.
like kind of confused.
Now, would love to dive into the thought. We talked about this a bit.
Mhm.
So, a number of the people watching this are people who are looking to break into technical writing in their
Mm,
first role,
that's fair.
and they often transfer from being like English teachers,
Mhm.
engineers. I would say those are the majority of people who transfer into technical writing from what we've seen.
Mhm.
And then you also have just new graduates.
Mm.
Now, when you look at those type of people um, and trying to get them to find alignment within their career. And I think similar to the career of product management and other professions, it's like, I want to be a product manager. Well, for what vertical, what type of company, and all
Mm.
those things. It's like
Mhm.
people are like, I like writing. I want to be a technical writer. It's like, how do you find alignment and to ensure that one is like you have longevity? And what does that look like?
It's a very broad question. So let's like parse it out into a couple phrases first,
Yeah.
and then we can kind of tackle it. So I think your initial one was I'm a new technical writer or I'm trying to break in the industry. What does that look like? The second part was I see product management at a very broad level. I'm a little bit confused by that
Well,
product management
I was just
intersection.
using it as an example,
Hmm.
similar to technical writing, how people say, "Hey, I want to be X," in this case, like
Hmm.
a technical writer,
Mm.
but they haven't quite found alignment yet on like
Hmm.
industry and type of company,
Okay, got it.
all those things.
And then the
And
last part was longevity in your career.
correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh no, all good. Yeah.
Okay, okay. Um, so, hmm, I think the first step that like a technical writing, and I actually have there's a mentorship program that exists at the University of Minnesota, which is my alma mater, and I was actually talking with a couple like new students very recently about this. Is like, well, like one is like actually having like interview prep, right? Like I think having the context of like talking to a technical writer, and I think this is what you're doing pretty well, Josh, is like having that experience of like learning what they go through. So when a product manager is interviewing you and asking questions about things, you're able to at least talk in the same language as them. So I think interview prep is really key um, in order to like even have your right foot forward. Like in order to like kind of sell like what you've been up to in your career and like figuring out like what value you contribute to the company. Um, there's a couple like more nifty answers that you could be like, like study HTML. You could study like, certain degrees of like programming concepts. Try out a no code, low code platform and like figuring out what that looks like. So you can talk about like databases from like a more educated perspective. So I think there's like a list of that. There's a bunch of like very like well written because we're technical writers and we all like writing books or curriculum. Kind of like step by steps there. I think from a broad level though, in order to just answer that question, is like try reaching out to people. Like Josh messaged me on LinkedIn and I said, yeah, sure, I'll come on. Right. So maybe just message a technical writer at a company that you want to work for and be like, hey, like, I know I had to pay for LinkedIn premium for this. So it at least shows that I had some buy-in. So can you help me out here or something like that? Second question, what it relates to product management. I think, yeah, like to our point earlier, is this is a role that's very integrated with the existing product teams. So just trying to figure out what even like product management looks like and like what it looks like from a top-down perspective. There's even more content on that actually, because everyone wants to be a product manager nowadays. And then the final question is longevity. And that's an interesting thing because technical writing as a career has shifted very quickly in the past couple of years based off my impression, where you used to have people that worked at companies for like 20 to 30 years and like knew their documentation from that perspective, but nowadays companies are like only alive for like 4 to 6 years, right? So I think longevity from my perspective is like how you're building your core skills as a technical writer, like what you understand from your own personal stack of like, I know how to write release notes now. I know how to like draft a quick like key stakeholder guide and like delivering that process to them. Or I've used Lucid Chart before. I know how to figure that out, right? Like, and then conveying that value to other people whenever you're working at a specific company. Because I found that through my career, a lot of companies have very similar asks, but with only their specific like type of industry terms to it. So generally, like if you want longevity in your career as a technical writing, you want to like maintain enthusiasm for like what you're doing and then also bringing to the table what value you offer instead of expecting people to like tell you what to do. Yeah, I think I answered all three of those questions, right?
Yeah, I think that was great.
Yeah.
Yeah, way to break it down. I feel like that's, great technical writing skills right there.
Yeah. I don't mean to be rude though. Like I was just
No,
trying
I
to have
love
a
that.
cross
Yeah,
that
yeah. I
information.
think it was much needed,
Yeah.
So I know we covered a lot here today.
Mhm.
Is there anything else that you want to let the people know watching this video of how they can better break into technical writing and succeed on the job?
Yeah. Um, so I think, and this is like going to be a very broad statement too, because it's hard to get into as much targeted stuff as possible. But there is a lot of information out there about being a technical writer. And what I would encourage a lot of people who are trying to like get into the industry is kind of shifting their mindset into like looking at things that they do on a day-to-day life and understanding that from a technical writing perspective. Like I mentioned, like playing a board game and like trying to understand it, like trying to explain it like a technical writer. Or for example, when I interviewed for Google at one time, they had me explain the game of tic-tac-toe to them, right? Like these are things where you're like trying to understand core concepts and explain them more effectively. And I think from like a more fun perspective, like you start understanding like, oh, I was watching TikTok and this is like a 10-second video of like how to access a website in a certain way or how to use the inspect element to figure this out. And you're like, oh, this was like really fun. And I'm like learning this process. This was actually a piece of technical documentation. So I think a lot of people would be like, do this, do this, do this, and you'll succeed. My biggest suggestion is just like kind of open up your eyes a little bit and be like, wow, this is like really fun because I get to be involved in so many different things. And I'm like getting better myself at explaining things to my parents or something. So that's what I'd say. Like be enthusiastic.
Yeah, I do think, just like you said, it's like technical writing translates into technical communication as a whole.
Hmm.
That's such a valuable thing. And that's, I think it's why it's such an important skill that everybody should learn it.
Yeah.
Biased, of course.
I also have another one, hot tip. If you're not a native English speaker, you do not. So, for example, I grew up in America, right? But like my parents were speaking Chinese and like Cantonese a lot growing up. So, like to be fair, I did not grow up reading like Pride and Prejudice or a lot of these like more English like related novels. There are tools out there like Grammarly or Outright, which will like help you out in terms of like writing out like these types of documentations. I think we have this like concept of you have to be like, and this is a little bit more of a hot take too, but the goal of like explaining things is super valuable. Because your like English might not be that great, shouldn't restrict you from pursuing a career as a technical writer because there's so many tools out there that can help you in order to like improve or become more understanding of like what you're trying to deliver. And by no means should you say like, you ran it through Grammarly, it's good to go, right? Like, I don't think of that way, but like, I would say like try not to disregard yourself if you feel like you're not like a very great writer, because you get better over time writing, right? So that's not my other thing. We always
Hey,
want more diversity in our companies.
well, Linus, thank you so much for being here with us today. And
Hmm.
yeah, I felt like there's a wealth of information that you shared with us. And for everybody watching, thank you for watching and listening. And I hope that you now have a better idea of how to take the next step in your career. And we're going to go ahead and rock and roll from here. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comment section. We'll go ahead and take a look at them after the video too. And that way, yeah, make sure we stay in touch and get everything answered.
Yeah, sounds good.
Awesome.
But
Cheers, guys.
all right, cheers.